Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today's video is a little bit different than anything else that I have ever done before, and it is kind of an explanation about a series that I have been reading that I had previously DNF'd. So obviously you know from the title that the series I'm going to be talking about today is The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher, which is an urban fantasy series that has been ongoing for quite a number of years. I don't remember what year Stormfront, the first book, was released, but it was in, I believe, the early 2000s. And it is a series, as I said, that I tried starting a really long time ago. I think in 2000 and, maybe 8 was probably when I read Stormfront for the first time. And when I read Stormfront all those years ago, it was at the urging of one of my good friends. So one of the friends that I had in high school and then into university, because I had already been in university by this time, but he was a friend from high school with whom I would often exchange books and talk about books. He was really into fantasy. He was actually my very first boyfriend's best friend. And so we had a lot of things in common. We both really liked fantasy novels, and we both really liked Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel, which was kind of the spin-off series from Buffy. So my friend, whose name was also Andrew, like my husband, recommended that I read this series by Jim Butcher, and he felt like I would really like it because I really liked fantasy and I really liked that kind of Buffy, Angel, Monster of the Week setup for TV shows. And that's kind of how he pitched the Dresden Files to me. So I read the first book, Stormfront, and I didn't really care for it. I didn't hate it, but I also didn't love it, and I guess there was just nothing about it that really captured me enough for me to want to go on and continue with the series. It was such a long time ago that I don't remember all of the qualms that I had with it at the time, but I will say that during that period of undergrad was definitely the time in my life where I was reading a lot less fantasy and reading more literary fiction, Canadian fiction, French fiction. I was reading a lot of the types of books that you would expect to read in university when you're doing a literature degree. So the types of books that require a lot of heavy analysis, a lot of the types of books that have usually really beautiful prose. And I think that probably above all things is that the Dresden Files just clashed so much with the other things that I was reading at that time that maybe it was just too different. I also, in terms of reading taste, even though I am a really huge Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan and I really liked Angel and I like that urban fantasy setup on television, it doesn't always ring true to me in fantasy books. And I think that's just because I grew up the type of fantasy lover who really enjoyed the sword and sorcery, the epic fantasy, the classic tropes, the nature-based magic and all those types of things. And that is such a jarring contrast to urban fantasy, which takes place in our world, but also incorporates things like firearms and those types of things that seems so. It creates, I think, like a sense of cognitive dissonance. Like I cannot reconcile fantasy with those urban elements. So it's something that I have struggled to connect with over time. And I think that it has grown on me more as the years have gone on. But I also believe that I have mellowed out a lot over the years. When I was younger, I would definitely make snap judgments a lot more quickly. And then it was in all facets of my life. And that's just a part of growing up and a part of evolving into the type of person that you want to be. And I think that was what was happening with me. So back, 15 years ago, I was much more likely to just say, no, that's not for me. I don't like that. Why would I read that? I didn't like XXX element, so goodbye series. I am a lot less like that now, and I am a lot more forgiving of little things that I don't enjoy as much. So we'll kind of fast forward to 2021. After joining BookTube and hearing so many people rave about the Dresden Files, so many people have the Dresden Files on their top fantasy series of all time. People talk about Harry Dresden being one of their favorite fantasy characters of all time. I have watched a lot of videos where people have said, even if you don't connect with books 1 and 2, this builds into such a rewarding series. Everything coalesces. It creates this really rich and rewarding world. So I also, now this year in 2021, have the benefit of being able to rely on booktubers whose opinions I really respect and whose tastes I find that I resonate with. So, there are some booktubers where I don't really like any of the books that they like. We tend to be at odds in the things that we enjoy. So if they had said that they liked Dresden Files, I would probably think like, okay, well, that makes sense. It probably still isn't the series for me. But there are lots of other booktubers whose tastes seem to align really well with mine, who really love this series. And so that made me want to give it another chance. I also have the really unfortunate personality quirk of hating not knowing things. So if there is a series that I don't know anything about and a lot of other people know about it, it really makes me want to read it. And I am not saying that this is a positive trait to have, but it is really hard to get rid of after a lifetime. I just like to know things and I want to know everything. And I know that this is not possible or even probable. And this has also gotten a lot better with time, but there's still a little bit of it there. And when there's a big series that everybody wants to read, I'm kind of the opposite of a book hipster, as Alan said in one of his videos. Like, I need to read it if everybody else has read it. It doesn't make it less appealing. It makes it like I'm almost fanatic in my need to read it. So that was definitely happening with the Dresden Files as well. So that was one piece of the puzzle. And another piece is that these are just such short books. They're perfect palate cleansers, perfect things to kind of throw on your TBR to read in a day or two and go from there. So I really felt like I needed to give Dresden Files another chance. So a couple of months ago, I re-picked up Stormfront. I actually think it was in December of 2020. I think it was one of the last books of the year that I read last year. And I picked up Stormfront again because I had a copy at home and reread it, and probably had like a very similar reaction to it as I did way back when in like 2008 or 10 or whenever it was that I read it. Which is to say that I didn't love it. I didn't hate it. I just felt kind of neutral about it. It fit that kind of noir detective genre really well. I thought that there were some good like one-liners that were thrown in there, but overall it didn't do a whole lot to drag me into the story. So, knowing everything that I knew about people really loving the series, it growing over time, the next month I picked up book 2. And I think this is where a big positive change happened for me. It was because I picked up book 2 on audiobook. And I am not a big audiobook for fiction person. I really like listening to nonfiction on audio, and I think that it works really well in terms of commuting or if I'm doing something like a puzzle, because it feels more like a lecture or a podcast. I don't really listen to podcasts, but I have sat through a lot of lectures in my life, and so it gives me that sense of familiarity. So I enjoy the audio nonfiction. But so many people had said that the audiobooks for Dresden were so good, and one was available through the library, so I picked it up through the library, and I really, really liked it. I know this is a bit of a mixed bag. I have spoken to some people who feel like Dresden comes off as a bit more smarmy, like it's harder to forgive some of the more frustrating elements of his personality on audio. But I feel the opposite. I feel like James Marsters, which I love that there is also a Buffy connection in terms of the narration, I feel like he lends a sense of self-deprecation to Harry Dresden that I really needed him to have. Because some of the stuff that he says and does is irritating. Like that I'm just going to put it out there. I don't know if that is an unpopular opinion or not, but like there are some frustrating aspects to Harry's personality. And I think that when James Marsters narrates it adds that element of self-deprecation that makes me go from like, oh, I want to strangle you, Harry, to, oh, Harry, like, what are you saying? What are you doing? But it helps create a little bit of that buffer, I think, for the more abrasive elements of Harry Dresden's personality. So jumping into the audiobooks really elevated the series for me, and it really elevated my enjoyment. And one of the issues that I have with audiobooks is, I think, a very similar issue to a lot of other people. I find that my attention can wane sometimes, or my mind can travel, which is something that happens to me a lot. So it's kind of doubly difficult in audiobooks. But I love James Marsters' narration so much that I stay totally focused. So I actually don't usually do anything while I'm listening to the Dresden Files audiobooks. I just kind of turn them on and lie there, like on the couch or in bed, or sit down next to my husband when he's gaming and just listen. And I find it so easy to be immersed in that experience. So listening to the audiobooks has definitely elevated that for me. And so that has definitely increased my enjoyment of the series overall. But between kind of everyone saying that the story builds and builds and the enjoyment I was getting out of the audiobooks, I decided that I was going to give the series 5 books before I made any official judgments, so that I could kind of see for myself where I wanted to go. And I just finished, actually this morning, right before work as I was eating my toast, I finished the 5th book. I finished listening to it on audio. And I can now say with full confidence that I will most definitely be continuing with the Dresden Files. And it's for a lot of different reasons. So I think there's still those kind of soft reasons that I talked about before, like not liking that there's this kind of big, really important, I would say. Like, this is one of the longest going, currently being written fantasy series right now. It has a huge fan base. It's very influential within the genre. So I think that it's hard for me to ignore a fantasy series of that importance. So that is definitely not the best reason to continue, but if I'm being honest, it's one of the reasons that I'm going to continue. And I also have been enjoying my time. I will say that with these first 5 books, there has not been an entry where I'm like, yes, this is the moment that I have fallen in love with the Dresden Files. I am 100% invested in Harry Dresden and I need to know what happens. But there also has not been an experience where I have wanted to turn off the audiobook or not continue or anything like that. I have found them to be really enjoyable. Book 3 has probably been my favorite of the first 5 so far, but I think that books 3, 4, and 5 were definitely a step above the first 2 for me. And I do start to see, or I am starting to see, those tendrils of a bigger story starting to reach out, especially after the most recent book, book 5. I at least believe that we have been introduced to a villain who's probably going to continue for the rest of the series, and it's a villain that I have a lot of interest in. We've been given a lot of clues about Harry's background, about his parentage, and there's an element of mystery around him that Harry himself doesn't even know, and that is starting to make me feel more invested in the story. The secondary characters, as I read the first couple of books, I have to say that I didn't really feel attached to many of the secondary characters, but as the books go on, I do find myself caring more and more about what happens to them, about their role in Harry's life, about how their relationships with Harry are about to change. And I think that they're becoming more dynamic, more fully realized characters as time goes on. So those are all reasons that I want to continue reading, and all reasons that I have been having a pretty good time with this series so far. I guess one of the biggest indicators about whether or not I was going to continue or not continue is how attached I feel to Harry himself, because this is not a character-driven story, but there is a lot of character focus. These are narrated from Harry's perspective. They are about his life. If you don't connect with Harry, then it's going to be very difficult to continue with the rest of this series. And again, after 5 novels, while I cannot say that Harry Dresden makes my list of favorite fantasy characters by any stretch of the imagination, I do find myself begrudgingly becoming more attached to Harry. Some of his foils and some of his struggles I can really relate to. I think that he is a person who is always trying to do the right thing, even if it is to the detriment of his own health, even if the decisions that he makes are really stupid. I think that Jim Butcher allows him to make a lot of mistakes. He is definitely not a perfect character. He Jim Butcher incorporates enough of the elements of that kind of gritty noir genre and those detective type figures while also injecting a lot of humanity into Harry Dresden, which I really, really like. And the longer I spend time with him and the more the books go on, the more complex he becomes. We get to see some of the trauma from his past. We get to see some of his home life and how his mentors influenced him, how the decisions that he made as a younger person have kind of had this ripple effect into the future and continue to inform the decisions that he makes as an adult. And I also really like that as the books go on, Harry ages. There is a lot of the time between the books, there's at least a year of a time skip. And so even though we start off with Harry as like this young guy in his early 20s, I imagine that as the series goes on, we're going to see him get older and older and care about different things. And I think that that is a really interesting element to this series. And I imagine it must be what makes people feel so attached to Harry as time goes on, because you really get to see how his life changes and you get to see him struggle and grapple with some of the things that we all struggle with and grapple with as we transition from our 20s into our 30s. So I think that it holds some of that same appeal that YA literature holds for teenagers as you get to see them go through and struggle with some of the really big moments of teenage life, but with like through the lens of fantasy. I think that we get to see Harry struggle and change through the lens of fantasy as well. And I think that that's a really engaging element. So I have high hopes for becoming more and more attached to Harry as time goes on, even if he hasn't quite reached that point for me yet. So, sorry, as you heard, Pippin went into bark mode, so I had to cut that part out. But I will say, overall, globally, I am really happy that I am continuing with the Dresden Files. There are certain elements of the story that, if they're not something that you can get used to, then it's probably not going to be the series for you. The writing is always going to be that kind of pulpy blend of witty one-liners and sometimes some like corny dialogue, but corny in a sense that feels like very intentional. It fits the mood, it fits the atmosphere, and it fits the genre. So if the writing style or those types of elements are not something that you connect with, then at least from getting this far in, getting to book 5, I don't think that that is going to change. But if that is something that you can embrace as a part of what Jim Butcher is going for, then I think that there is a lot to enjoy. I think that the books have become funnier as they have gone on. I think that Jim Butcher's writing and plotting has gotten better as time has gone on. And I imagine that that's probably only going to continue to improve as the series progresses. So I am looking forward to seeing that. As I said earlier in the video, I still do have like an oh Harry moment every now and then. But overall, I do think that Harry is also starting to grow on me as a character. There are elements of his personality that are, I will say, that are more difficult than others, but I think that Harry is very aware of his flaws and he is able to admit when he is acting in a way that is probably inappropriate. And he's either able to make light of it or he is able to try to change it, which I really appreciate. Humor in Harry Dresden's character is something that I really appreciate in general, because I think for someone who has gone through the types of things that Harry has gone through, from losing his parents to his having difficulties with mentors, and I don't want to be spoilery here, but he has had betrayals in his past and he has had really difficult things that he has had to get through. And you can either, there are lots of different coping mechanisms that can come out of that. You can repress, you can do something called isolation of affect, where you allow yourself to feel nothing, or you can choose a mature defense mechanism such as humor, and you can poke fun at yourself and at your situation. And even though I think Harry is very self-deprecating and he does not give himself a lot of credit for the resilience that he has, the humor that shines through in a lot of his encounters and the way that he reacts when he is in a really dangerous situation, gives me confidence that he has a lot more emotional maturity than he gives himself credit for. So I really like the character that Jim Butcher is starting to build up. And I do have hopes that after, as I get through the whole series, that there will be a lot to pick through with Harry Dresden. And he's a character that I would love to do some more in-depth videos on. But I feel like I need to get to know him a little better. So I'm glad that I'm going to be continuing past the 5 books so that I can get to know his character a little bit better. For people who have continued on with Dresden, who are big fans of Dresden, some of the questions that I have would be, when did you start to really feel invested in Harry's story? Were you all in at the beginning? Was there a certain point in the series when you really started to feel that? Are there things that you struggled with when you started reading the series, or was it instant love from the beginning? If you're really into detective stories, if you're really into urban fantasy, I could see how this could be a big love from the get-go. But obviously this is the case with me. It's taking time for it to kind of grow into something that I am appreciating, and hopefully will come to love as time goes on. But I would really like to know where everybody else sits with that. How does Harry rank in your overall favorite fantasy characters? Does he make the list? Are there other characters from the story that you really like? I'm trying to be not spoilery here because I want this to just be a conversation that can help people who are like me, who struggled with the first book and who are debating continuing on. But I will say that the character of Michael, I love. I really want to see more of Michael, and I really, really like that lawful good character in fantasy, because I think that a lot of modern fantasy shies away from that because we're really invested in the morally gray characters and we want to see complexity and we don't want to get caught up in those classic tropes and good versus evil. But there's something so refreshing and so wholesome about a character who just wants to do the right thing for the right reasons. And I think that he makes a beautiful contrast to Harry, because I think they both have such big hearts, and you can see where both their paths can sometimes lead to negative consequences or positive outcomes. And I think that that's a really interesting dynamic. So really, really love Michael's character. And I really love the character of Thomas the vampire. So I won't say anything else about that. I don't know if either of these characters is going to show up in other books outside the main 5, but those are 2 characters that I really, really enjoy and I would really like to get to know more about and get to see more of. I probably will have to do some videos in the future where I talk some Dresden spoilers, because I know there's a lot of people who like the Dresden Files, and there's been a lot of things that I have really enjoyed, but I don't want to talk about them in a spoilery context. So maybe in the future, or if in the comments, if you can hide your spoilers, then we can talk about them for the first 5 books there. But overall, like I said, I will be continuing with the Dresden Files. I have really enjoyed my time with books 1 through 5. I'm looking forward to seeing how this world builds. I have confidence that Jim Butcher will be able to create something really engaging and really epic in scope. Despite the fact that this is urban fantasy, I think that this has the potential for me to become a really epic series. And for many of you who love it, you probably are like, yeah, Sarah, it does become an epic series. We already know that. We've known that for a long time. So I would love to hear from you if you did continue with Dresden and you love it. If, unlike me, you decided to give it a go and it was not for you, then I would really like to know the reasons why. And I will see you with another video soon. Bye!